A whisper echoes through the void, a ripple across the cosmic fabric that few can sense and fewer still can understand. The Starforge has awakened. Caidan Voss stares at the swirling maelstrom of plasma and magnetic storms that define the edges of the impossible structure. From the cockpit of the Omen, his ship hovers at the very threshold of something ancient, something alive. For as long as recorded history spans, the Starforge has been a myth, a legend passed between starfaring civilizations. Some called it a god's anvil, where stars were hammered into being. Others believed it was a tomb, the husk of something that once burned too brightly. And then there were the warnings, etched into the histories of species long vanished, that to touch the Starforge was to invite oblivion. Yet, in the endless cold of the cosmos, myths were mere echoes of lost knowledge. Caidan had spent his life chasing such whispers, drawn to the mysteries that others feared. He was an explorer, a scientist in the loosest sense of the word, but most of all, he was reckless. And now the universe had laid its greatest secret before him, daring him to reach out and take it. The mission had never been his alone. The Omen carried a delegation, a collection of humans and aliens bound together by fragile alliances and shared curiosity. The Vielsith, ancient and rigid in their hierarchies, had been the first to protest humanity's presence in this venture. To them, humans were young, desperate things, eager to carve their name into the galaxy without understanding the price of their ambition. But even among humanity's own ranks, there was division. Some feared what the Starforge represented. Others, like Caidan, saw only possibility. As they drifted closer, the ship's sensors screamed in protest, unable to process the raw forces at work. Magnetic fields bent in paradoxical spirals, light itself folding and refracting as if time and space were nothing more than loose threads to be rewoven. The Starforge did not simply exist, it willed itself into being. Maintain distance. The command came from the mission's lead scientist, Dr. Amara Keen, her voice tight with urgency. We have no idea what kind of gravitational anomalies we're dealing with. But Caidan had already unstrapped himself. He barely heard her words over the deafening pull in his chest, the certainty that this was not just another artifact to be catalogued. It was a message, a beckoning hand extended from something beyond comprehension. And in that moment, logic fell away, replaced by an instinct so primal it drowned out everything else. Before anyone could stop him, before reason could tighten its grip and pull him back, Caidan launched himself into the void. There was no impact, no transition between one state of existence and the next. One moment he was human, flesh, bone, thought, and then he was something else. The Starforge did not reject him. It did not consume him. It accepted him. He felt the weight of 1,000 collapsing suns, the silent screams of stars devoured by the hunger of time itself. He saw galaxies winking into and out of existence like fireflies in an eternal dusk. And then, amidst the chaos of creation and destruction, something reached back. Power, raw and unshackled, surged through him. It was not his to wield, and yet it became part of him, threading itself through his veins, turning blood into molten light. His right arm, his very flesh, was no longer flesh at all. It burned with the radiance of a living sun, a tether to the heart of the Starforge itself. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Gravity returned with a vengeance. The pull of reality seized him, and he was hurled from the Starforge's embrace, flung back toward the Omen with the force of a dying star's last breath. Impact alarms shrieked, crew members shouted, but Caidan barely registered the chaos. As he crashed onto the ship's deck, the silence that followed was thick with disbelief. The Vielsith delegation recoiled, their luminous eyes reflecting the searing glow of Caidan's transformed limb. Dr. Keen took a step back, one hand over her mouth, the other clutching at her scanner as if it could explain what their minds refused to accept. Caidan rose unsteadily, his vision blurred by the lingering afterimage of infinity. His arm pulsed, light leaking from his skin in golden waves, and beneath the glow, something whispered. The Starforge had left its mark, and it was far from done with him. Caidan Voss lay sprawled on the deck of the Omen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His right arm, if it could still be called that, radiated an eerie, pulsating light, a miniature sun bound to his flesh. The silence that followed his return was more profound than any vacuum. The crew, human and alien alike, stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of awe, terror, and disbelief. Dr. Amara Keene was the first to move. She cautiously stepped forward, her scanner trembling in her grip, as she attempted to process the impossible.
"Caidan, what did you do?"
He tried to speak, but the words felt distant, as if his mind had not yet returned from the depths of the Starforge. His body felt weightless and impossibly heavy at the same time. The heat emanating from his arm did not burn him, yet the air around him shimmered with the sheer intensity of its presence. One of the Vielsith emissaries, a towering being wrapped in flowing iridescent robes, took a sharp step back. Their voice, when it came, was laced with fear. "You have violated the sacred boundary. The Starforge does not gift, it claims." Caidan forced himself to sit up. I don't think it killed me." His voice was hoarse, his throat raw as if he had swallowed fire. "It showed me things. He hesitated, his mind still reeling from the visions. "It chose me." That statement sent ripples of tension through the room. Keene's scanner emitted a high-pitched whine before the display flickered erratically. "I don't understand this," she muttered. "Your body, Caidan, you're not human anymore. At least, not entirely. I feel fine." A lie, but one he had to tell himself to keep from unraveling. A low hum resonated from the Vielsith delegation. Their leader, a figure known as High Speaker Korzeth, narrowed their golden, multi-pupiled eyes. "You must be contained." Caidan turned his glowing hand toward them, instinctively raising it in a defensive gesture, and the room was suddenly bathed in a warm, golden light. His heart pounded as he realized that the energy within him was alive. Not just a weapon, not just a force, but something with will. "Stand down," he warned, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Korzeth's second-in-command, a Vielsith warrior clad in crystalline battle armor, drew a blade that shimmered. With dark energy, "He is an aberration. If we do not act now, this vessel will be his first sacrifice." The situation was spiraling out of control. Keene quickly stepped between them. "Wait. We need to understand what's happening before anyone makes a move." The tension hung heavy, in the air. Caidan's mind was still processing what had happened, but one thing was clear. He wasn't the same. He could feel the energy coursing through him, its presence coiling like a second consciousness just beneath the surface. It was not just power. It was awareness. A whisper drifted through his thoughts. "You are the first. You are the last. You are the bridge between stars." His breath caught. He had heard that voice in the Starforge, in the endless cascade of visions that had seared themselves into his soul. But now, it was inside him. The warrior lunged. Caidan reacted before thought could intervene. His arm flared, a stream of golden plasma erupting from his palm. It was not an attack, it was an instinct, a reflex to defend. The energy struck the warrior's blade, sending a shockwave through the chamber. The force was not destructive, but it disarmed the warrior instantly, melting the weapon into molten fragments without harming its wielder. Gasps filled the room. Korzeth, their composure shaken, took another step back. This should not be possible. Caidan lowered his arm, his breathing heavy. He had not meant to use his power. He had felt it react on its own. Keene's voice was measured but urgent. "Everyone needs to calm down. We don't understand what's happening to Caidan yet, but if you try to kill him, none of us will get any answers." The Vielsith warriors remained tense, but the immediate violence was diffused. Still, the fear remained thick and undeniable. The ship's communications panel crackled to life. A transmission, urgent and encrypted. The deep, guttural tones of a high-ranking Vielsith command officer filled the cabin. "By order of the Exarch, the human anomaly is to be terminated immediately." He is a threat to the stability of all known civilizations. Keen turned sharply toward Caidan, eyes wide. We need to get off this ship. Now. Caidan swallowed hard, looking down at his hand, at the living sun tethered to his flesh. A moment ago, he had been a man grasping for understanding. Now, he was a fugitive. And deep within his mind, the whisper spoke again. This is only the beginning. The omen shook violently as the emergency klaxons blared. The Valsith fleet had entered engagement range, their warships locking onto the vessel with precision. Caidan barely had time to process what had happened before the ship's pilot, Lieutenant Joran Malik, yelled over the intercom. They're charging weapons. Shields won't hold if they hit us with full force. Caidan clenched his glowing fist. They mean to kill me. Dr. Amara Keen turned from the command console, her face a mask of controlled panic. Not just you. They're going to wipe all of us out to erase what you've become. Caidan could see it in their eyes. His former allies, the humans and aliens who had once stood beside him, now watching him with barely concealed fear. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else, and that terrified them. The Valsith delegation, their robes swaying with the vibrations of the ship, looked to their leader, High Speaker Korzeth, for guidance. But Korzeth was silent, watching Caidan with a mixture of fear and reverence. Keen turned to the pilot. Can you get us out of here? Joran scoffed. You want me to outrun the most advanced fleet in this sector? In this ship? Not happening. Another impact rocked the omen. Warning lights flashed across the bridge. The Valsith weren't waiting for negotiations. We have no time. Korzeth finally spoke, their multi-pupiled eyes locking onto Caidan. You wield something beyond mortal comprehension. You must prove that you can control it or you will be annihilated. Caidan looked down at his arm. The energy was roiling beneath his skin, a miniature sun barely contained within his flesh. The whispers of the Starforge still echoed in his mind. You are the first. You are the last. You are the bridge between stars. What if I can't control it? He muttered. Then we all die, Keen said flatly. The moment stretched. Tension, heavy in the air. Another explosion rocked the ship. The shields were failing. They wouldn't last another barrage. Then the decision was made for him. The ship's hull buckled as a Valsith boarding torpedo pierced the outer bulkhead, embedding itself deep into the corridor just outside the bridge. A screech of metal, a brief moment of silence, and then the doors exploded inward. Valsith warriors flooded into the chamber, moving like liquid shadow, their crystalline armor refracting the light from Caidan's burning arm. Their weapons hummed, forged from dark matter capable of slicing through steel as if it were paper. Caidan barely had time to react before one of them lunged. Instinct took over. His arm flared, the heat of a star condensed into a single, blinding pulse. The Valsith warrior was flung backward, crashing into the corridor wall with a force that cracked the metal. The others hesitated, adjusting their approach. They weren't just trying to kill him anymore. They were analyzing him. Korzeth stepped forward, raising a hand. Enough. Their voice carried the weight of authority, and for a moment the warriors paused. If you strike him down now, you risk igniting forces beyond your comprehension. One of the Valsith commanders, a hardened veteran with deep glowing scars, sneered. What he wields is a weapon. If we let him live, he could burn entire worlds. Caidan took a step forward. I didn't ask for this. His voice carried a strange resonance, as if the energy inside him was speaking alongside him. But if you think I'm going to let you execute me because you fear what I am, then you'll see exactly why the Starforge gave me this power. The warriors moved as one. Caidan reacted faster. With a sweep of his arm, the air itself ignited. A wave of pure solar fire erupted from his fingertips, sweeping through the boarding party. The metal walls glowed white-hot, but Caidan focused the energy so precisely that it did not consume his allies, only the invaders. The Valsith warriors screamed as their weapons disintegrated, their armor melting away as the raw force of a sun's heart tore through them. Within seconds, the corridor was empty, the threat reduced to smoldering embers. Silence fell. Everyone was staring at him, not just in shock, but in something deeper, something more primal. Fear. Korzeth, the high speaker, slowly stepped forward. "You have crossed the threshold," they murmured. "You are no longer merely human." Caidan's hands were trembling, but not from exhaustion, from certainty. The power wasn't just inside him, it was awakening. Keen's voice was barely a whisper. "Caidan, what are you?" Before he could answer, the ship lurched violently. Joran cursed from the pilot's chair. "We've got a bigger problem. Velzith capital ships are repositioning. They're preparing a planet killer." "Weapon." Caidan's pulse quickened. "What?" Keen turned sharply. Joran's hands flew across the controls. "The Velzith don't take chances. If they can't contain a threat, they erase it." Caidan clenched his fist. His mind was clear now. There was no more room for doubt. The Velzith were afraid of him, afraid of what he had become. And they were willing to burn this entire sector of space just to be certain he didn't survive. Korzeth let out a slow breath. "This is the way of things. Power demands sacrifice." "No," Caidan said firmly. "Power demands responsibility." His body moved before thought. He strode toward the bridge's viewport, his glowing arm raised. He could feel the pulse of the energy within him, like the heartbeat of a star waiting to be unleashed. And then, for the first time, he truly listened to the whispers. A surge of knowledge flowed into him, not as words, but as understanding. He saw the Velzith fleet, their energy signatures, the delicate balance of power between their ships. He saw the way their weapons charged, the cascading fields of destructive force they were about to unleash, and he saw how to stop it. With a deep breath, Caidan extended his will. The sun in his arm flared brighter than ever before. A beam of pure, stellar force erupted outward, not as an attack but as a command. The energy spiraled, bending reality itself, and for a moment, the stars seemed to sing. The Velzith fleet froze. Their weapons dimmed. Caidan's energy had interrupted their systems at a fundamental level. They could not fire. They could not move. For the first time in their long, war-torn history, the Velzith were powerless before something greater than themselves. And in that moment, Caidan understood what the Starforge had intended. This was never about war. It was never about destruction. It was about balance. He turned to the stunned crew, his voice calm but firm. "We're leaving. The Velzith will not fire. They cannot." Joran hesitated, then nodded, engaging the ship's engines. The Omen pulled away, slipping past the immobilized fleet. Korzeth watched him carefully. "You have changed the course of history, Caidan Voss." He met their gaze, the glow in his arm pulsing steadily. "No," he said. "This is just the beginning." And deep in the void, the Starforge whispered its approval. The Omen surged through the void, its engines burning at full thrust as it left the immobilized Velzith fleet behind. The crew was silent, their faces pale, their bodies tense. They had just witnessed something impossible, something that defied the laws of physics, strategy, and war itself. Caidan stood at the center of the bridge, his right arm pulsing with a radiance that cast elongated shadows across the walls. His breathing was steady, his mind clear. But deep inside, he could feel it, the presence. The energy inside him was more than just raw power. It was watching, listening, waiting. Then, the whisper came again. "This is not the end. The Forge does not gift without purpose." He stiffened. The words felt closer this time, as if spoken not just inside his mind but through the very atoms of his being. He turned to Dr. Amara Keen, who had barely taken her eyes off him since their escape. "You saw what I did," he said quietly. "You felt it." Keen swallowed, her throat dry. "You didn't just stop them, Caidan, you altered them. That was more than just energy manipulation. You rewrote their physics." Joran, still gripping the flight controls, let out a nervous laugh. Right. So we're just going to pretend like we weren't nearly vaporized by a galactic empire? They're not going to fire, Caidan said. They can't fire. Duran gestured to the vast expanse of space ahead. Maybe not now, but they'll recover, and when they do, they're not going to see you as some enlightened messiah, Voss. They're going to see you as a threat to all existence. A warning siren blared. Proximity alert, Duran muttered, scanning the readouts. His expression darkened. And speaking of threats, a gravitational anomaly rippled through the void ahead. The sensors flared with impossible readings, warping space-time into an ever-tightening spiral. Keen paled. That's not natural. Korzeth, standing silently at the edge of the bridge, let out a low, reverent whisper. It is the judgment. Caidan's pulse quickened. He stepped toward the viewport, his eyes locking onto the impossible structure forming ahead. The Starforge had followed him, or perhaps he had never truly left it. It was vast beyond comprehension, no longer just a structure of cosmic myth, but an entity. Its swirling mass of plasma, solar winds, and gravitational singularities pulsed as if breathing. And at its heart, something moved. Something waited. Keen's voice was barely a whisper. Caidan, I don't think this is over. A voice, not a whisper but a command, resonated through his entire being. You have been chosen. Now be tested. The bridge buckled. The ship's systems flickered as tendrils of radiant energy lashed out from the Starforge, wrapping around the Omen like the fingers of a cosmic titan. Duran yelled, struggling with the controls. We're getting pulled in. Caidan turned to Keen. Get everyone to the escape pods. Keen stared at him. What? No, we're not leaving you. I was never supposed to leave, Caidan said. His voice was calm, but inside his heart pounded like a war drum. The Starforge had never given him a gift. It had given him a task. He turned, stepping toward the viewport. The energy in his arm pulsed in sync with the Forge's core. The power wasn't resisting. It was calling. Korzeth stepped forward. You carry the light of 1,000 dying stars, Caidan Voss. You are the first to return from the Forge unchanged, yet not unchanged. Do you understand what is happening? Caidan exhaled. No. Korzeth inclined their head. Then walk forward and understand. He placed his glowing hand against the viewport. Reality broke apart. Caidan stood at the heart of creation. The landscape was impossible, a sky of swirling galaxies, a ground made of shifting constellations. He was inside something ancient, something thinking. Before him, a figure coalesced from fire and plasma, its body shaped from the heart of dying stars. It had no face, no form that could be truly described, yet Caidan knew. It saw him. You are the first, the being said. Its voice was not sound, but gravity, radiation, the very hum of the cosmos itself. Caidan swallowed. First, to do what? The being extended a hand. Within its grasp, a miniature star pulsed, its light fragile and newborn. To wield the light, to carry it not as destruction, but as creation. Caidan felt the weight of the moment press against his soul. The Starforge had not given him power to destroy. It had given him power to heal, to reignite what has been lost, the being said, or to let the dark consume it. Caidan's chest tightened. He saw visions, worlds on the brink of collapse, stars dimming into endless night. The power inside him could reshape them. He could bring life back to dying suns, or he could let them fade forever. A choice. A responsibility. You chose me, Caidan whispered. But why? The being flickered, its form shifting. Because you reached into the Forge. Because you defied the warnings. Because you were willing to be more. Caidan clenched his glowing fist. And if I say no? The light in the being's hand dimmed. Then you will fade and all will fade with you. Caidan looked up, into the vastness of the universe, the billions of stars that still burned, and the trillions more that had already died. He thought of the Veilsith, the humans, the fragile alliances, and the brutal wars. He thought of how quickly civilizations rose and fell, how fleeting everything truly was. And then he thought of something deeper. What if he could change it? Not rule, not conquer, but ignite. His heartbeat steadied. He reached forward, touching the newborn star in the being's palm. Light exploded outward. Caidan gasped as he was pulled back into the omen. The Starforge was gone. Or perhaps it had never been a place at all. His arm still burned with celestial fire, but now it was controlled. He could feel the energy listening to him, waiting. Keen was at his side. Caidan, what happened? He looked at her. For the first time, he knew the answer. We're not just meant to take from the stars, he murmured. We're meant to give back. Outside, the Veilsith fleet was still frozen. The war was over before it began, because they all saw it now. Caidan Voss was no longer just a man. He was the kindling of a new fire, and the universe was waiting to burn bright once more. Silence blanketed the bridge of the omen, not the kind born from fear or uncertainty, but the kind that signified something profound had just occurred, something that defied explanation, something that changed the course of history. Caidan stood motionless, his right arm still pulsing with the restrained glow of a living star. But it was different now. It no longer lashed out uncontrollably, no longer threatened to consume everything around him. It had become something more, a force he could control, a presence that no longer whispered in the back of his mind, but instead hummed in quiet agreement. Keen was the first to speak, her voice hushed, almost reverent. Caidan, what did you do? He exhaled slowly, still feeling the raw weight of the moment settle over him. I listened, he said. Joran scoffed from his seat, rubbing a hand down his face. Listened? To what exactly? Because from where I'm sitting, you just had a cosmic conversation with an eldritch star god and walked away like it was a morning briefing. Caidan allowed himself a small smile. It was easier to focus on the humor, easier to ground himself in something tangible. But beneath that, he knew this was no laughing matter. He turned his gaze toward the viewport. Outside, the vastness of space stretched endlessly, and floating within it was the Veilsith fleet completely still. Their weapons were still primed, their engines still hot, yet they had not fired. They had witnessed what had happened, and, for the first time in their long history, they had been forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. They won't attack, Caidan murmured. They can't. Korzeth, the High Speaker, watched him with an intensity that felt like the weight of 1,000 ancestors pressing down on his soul. What did the Forge show you? Caidan hesitated before answering, not because he was uncertain, but because the truth was so much more than words could convey. It showed me what's coming. A collective shiver ran through the crew. What's coming? Keen pressed. Caidan turned to face them fully. The Forge wasn't just a test. It wasn't just something waiting for the right being to reach into it. It was a warning. He paused. The stars are dying. Keen blinked. Stars always die, Caidan. That's how the cycle of the universe works. No, he said. Not like this. Not naturally. Korzeth's expression darkened. You speak of the silent extinction. Caidan's head snapped toward them. You know? Korzeth gave a slow, grave nod. Legends among our kind whisper of something vast and unseen, a force that devours the light itself. Stars that should burn for millions of years are vanishing, gone without trace, without supernova, without rebirth. We believed it to be mere myth. Caidan felt the fire in his veins stir, as though responding to the knowledge being spoken aloud. It's not myth, he said grimly. It's real, and it's accelerating. A heavy silence settled over the bridge. The implications were impossible to ignore. Keen shook her head in disbelief. You're telling me that something is going around snuffing out stars like candles? That's insane. Korzeth's voice was solemn. And yet it aligns with what our ancient scholars feared. They turned to Caidan. You were not granted that power merely to wield it. You were given it because you are now a keeper of the flame, a force to push back the dark. Joran let out a dry chuckle. No pressure, huh? Caidan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling through his nose. I don't know if I can stop it. His glowing hand clenched into a fist. But I know I have to try, Keen frowned. How? It's not like you can just fly up to a dying star and relight it like a damn campfire. Caidan met her gaze, his own brimming with quiet certainty. Maybe I can. Her breath caught. He turned back to the viewport, watching the motionless Vaelsith fleet. The Forge didn't give me this power for war, he continued. It gave it to me to restore. His eyes drifted toward the far reaches of space, toward the places where the darkness had already begun creeping in. I can reignite what was lost. I can keep the light alive. Qorzeth bowed their head. Then you are truly the first of your kind. Caidan sighed. Then I guess I have work to do. Keen hesitated before stepping closer. If you go down this path, there's no going back, Caidan. He smiled, though there was a weight behind it. There was never a way back, not after I touched the forge. She studied him, then nodded. Then let's figure out where to start. Joran grunted. So we're really doing this? Just flying into the unknown to fight some cosmic void eater? Fantastic. I always wanted to be part of a legendary suicide mission. Caidan grinned. Good thing we're not planning to die. Joran rolled his eyes. Sure, that makes me feel so much better. As the Omen adjusted course, the Vaelsith ships began to slowly turn, their once hostile stance shifting into something else. Reverence, understanding, the war that could have begun had ended before the first shot was fired, and in its place a new mission had begun. The universe was waiting, and Caidan Voss had work to do. The Omen drifted through the void, its engines humming softly as it ventured into uncharted space. Behind it, the Vaelsith fleet remained motionless, no longer an enemy force but silent observers, bearing witness to the first steps of something new, something greater. Caidan Voss stood at the viewport, watching the endless stretch of stars ahead. His right arm, still pulsing with the power of a living sun, felt different now. It was no longer just a burden, no longer an uncontrollable force. It was a purpose, a calling. He closed his fist, and the energy within him pulsed in response. He could feel the stars, the distant dying embers of worlds long forgotten, the fragile flickers of light struggling against the encroaching dark. He was more than a man now. He was a keeper of the flame, a guardian of the light. Keen's voice pulled him from his thoughts. We've plotted a course to the nearest dying system. He turned to face her. She looked exhausted, shaken by everything they had just been through, yet her eyes burned with determination. She had chosen to stay. They all had. Joran leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. So what's the plan, O cosmic fire god? You just gonna touch the dying stars and bring them back to life? Caidan exhaled. I don't know, he admitted, but I have to try. Qorzeth stepped forward, their ethereal form casting long shadows across the bridge. The Starforge did not choose lightly. You are the first to wield its gift. You may not know the way forward, but in time, the path will reveal itself. Caidan met their gaze. Then I'll walk it. The whisper in his mind returned. Softer. This time, less commanding. More of a guiding hand than an overwhelming presence. You are the first. But you will not be the last. A chill ran down his spine. He turned back toward the viewport, staring into the abyss beyond. For all the power he now wielded, for all the certainty the Forge had instilled in him, one truth still lingered at the edges of his thoughts. He was not alone. Somewhere out there, across the infinite reaches of the cosmos, something else was stirring. Something old, something that had been waiting, watching. something that feasted on dying light. His jaw tightened. He could feel it now, just beyond the edge of his perception, a force vast and silent, devouring the warmth of creation one star at a time. The silent extinction. The real fight had yet to begin. He turned to his crew, the first souls to walk beside him on this impossible journey. "Let's go," he said. The omen surged forward, cutting through the void like a streak of fire. And far beyond, in the cold abyss where stars went to die, something turned its gaze toward him and took notice.